Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to break down how stories are put together by looking at something called the 3-act structure. Now on this channel we've actually touched upon the 3-act structure a couple of times before when relating to social videos, and the reason for that is that most good stories follow this structure, so it makes sense to put that structure into your social videos for maximum engagement. Today though we're going to go a bit more in depth into what it actually is, how it relates to narrative film, and look at a few examples so that you can have a bit more of an informed decision when editing your videos, no matter how long or short. So let's get into it. On a very basic level, the 3-act structure typically breaks down into beginning, middle, and end. And that's true in most stories, not just film. Even though most of us aren't even aware of it, we use this structure almost every time we tell someone a story, no matter how trivial. And as an example, at the end of the video, I'll show you how a funny little social media post also has this structure. So, let's take a look at Act 1, the beginning. Generally, in the first act, 3 things happen. The main character is established, the setting is established, and there's also an inciting incident, which is basically something that happens that kicks off the rest of the story. There's also a 4th thing that happens in the first act, and that is something that draws you into the story, and that can actually be one of the 3 things that I've just mentioned, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it might be a flash forward to something that happens later on that gets you intrigued about what's going to happen in the story. So let's move on to the setting and why it needs to be established. Well, if you're going into a movie knowing nothing about it, what's one of the first things you notice? Usually, you get an understanding of where and when this is set. For instance, is it set in an alternate universe? Is it set in the real world? Maybe it's set in the real world, but there's something different about it. Maybe it's the past or the future. Either way, in the first act, the setting needs to be communicated to the viewer, whether that's visually or expositionally through dialogue.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And I'm not just talking about the physical location of the story either, because some films are set across multiple locations or multiple time periods. But they will all contribute to the setting of the film. Also in the first act, the characters are established. You'll learn who the main character is and what they're doing at this point in their lives. Maybe it's based around a job they have, or maybe they're on vacation, or maybe they don't have a job. But that's not the only thing we learn. Really, the most important thing about the character is, surprise, surprise, their character. Are they hot-headed? Are they intelligent? Are they selfish? They might have a character trait that is seen as a weakness that they need to overcome, but most likely the character will have several traits because most relatable characters are usually a bit more complex. For instance, they might be quite selfish and not have many morals, but then something happens in the story that changes that, rather than just being a simple good guy or a bad guy, because that's more like real people. And then we have the inciting incident. This is something that happens in the beginning of the story that affects the rest of the plot. And most often this inciting incident sparks a goal to achieve by the end of the film, which takes us into Act 2. Now this is generally where the main character or characters progress through the plot, overcoming obstacles as they go, and actively pursuing the achievement of that goal. And we call this active pursuit rising action because it tends to elevate as the story moves on. And there's a whole manner of things that happen in this act. It might be a simple checklist for the character to achieve to attain that goal. Maybe a new character is introduced to help them achieve their goal. Or maybe something happens that sparks another goal that they have to achieve to get to the final goal. Or something could happen that makes the character no longer want that goal and instead go for a different one. The point is that Act 2 is the act that transitions the main character from their state in Act 1 to their state in Act 3, which we'll talk about now. So Act 3 usually consists of 3 main things: the conflict, climax, and resolution. The conflict is usually something that's stopping the character from achieving that goal set out in Act 1, whether it's the antagonist, such as a bad guy, or maybe a monster. It could even be external factors like, I don't know, the weather. Or it could be an internal conflict where the character's goal is to overcome something within themselves. So moving on to the climax. Now this is the point of the movie where the goal is finally achieved. It's the thing we've been waiting for the entire film. We see the main characters finally overcome their biggest obstacle yet, and then it can either change their life or allow them to return back to their normal life, which leads us on to the last part, which is the resolution. So this is more often than not the happily ever after part where the story gets resolved. It's what happens to the characters once that final goal is reached. And in a lot of films, it is more often than not a feeling of, like I said, happily ever after. But not always. Different things can happen depending on the story. For example, the character might have died as a result of achieving that final goal, in which case the resolution might show what happens to the supporting characters as they come to terms with it and get on with their own lives. Now remember at the beginning of the video when I said that these 3 acts also work in the little stories that we tell each other? Well, I did write out a little example of a story, but I thought it'd be better to use a real world example. So this is basically what my aunt put on Facebook about my mum a couple of weeks ago. Right, you're going to have to bear with me because I might just burst out laughing. But this is a post my aunt put on Facebook a few weeks ago. All the post says is, "Quote of the day, effing hell, what's happening?" Now, if that isn't something to pull you into the story, I don't know what is, right? But I mean, we all knew that she was currently on holiday with my other aunt and my mum. And my cousin responded with, "What was happening? Don't leave us in suspense." So then my aunt then replied with, "We were walking along the road, minding our own business." So that's setting the scene for you there. So that's something that's in Act 1, okay? "When suddenly we heard the above quote being screamed." "We looked around and there was Sue, my mum, on her mobility scooter, going at 100 miles an hour backwards and spinning in a circle." So there you have it. There's the entire first act. You've got the inciting incident, you had that intrigue in the beginning, and you also had the setting. Like obviously the inciting incident is like the scream. And then they look round and you know, my mum is spinning around on the scooter backwards. And then she goes on to say, Pat, that's their friend, Pat was hanging onto the front basket to try and stop it spinning, and it took her with it. I mean, there you go. That's the second act there, and it's also the third act. So the second act is Pat trying to stop it. So you had the inciting incident, which was it spinning around, which sets the goal of trying to stop it. And there's Pat going onto the scooter to try and stop it. And, you know, it took her with it. So that's like the conflict there. Like, she's trying to stop it, but it's not happening. Anyway, for the climax, I mean, the climax is obviously them stopping the scooter, but that's not included in the story because it's just assumed that eventually they did stop it. But anyway, she goes on to say, "Needless to say, I got the blame. All I did was hang the heavy shopping bag on the handlebars of her scooter. How was I to know it was going to slip onto the reverse button?" So that was basically the resolution of the story. So that's what happened after they stopped it. She got the blame, and also you get a little bit of a history lesson as to why the whole thing happened as well, which can also happen in stories. Obviously, it does all the time. But anyway, that's just a perfect example of the 3-act structure working there as it should, just in a normal story. I mean, you know, my aunt, when she typed this, she didn't think, right, how do I break down this story into 3 acts? It just comes naturally to us. Anyway, let's take a look at what we've learned. So in Act 1, the setting and the main characters are established. And then we have the inciting incident, which sets out the goal to be achieved in Act 3. Then in Act 2, we have the rising action, where the main character or characters usually have to overcome several objects as they actively pursue that final goal. And then in Act 3, the conflict is their biggest obstacle yet, which they then have to overcome at the climax before the film finally gets resolved. Okay guys, that was our breakdown of the 3-act structure. I hope you learned something, and if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.